On a warm, quiet evening in October of 1999, a 75-year-old man named Steve Beard sat on the patio of his sprawling mansion in Austin, Texas. He was sipping on a cocktail, listening to the gentle rustling of the leaves in the massive trees surrounding his property. Behind the house, a small creek flowed peacefully, adding to the tranquil atmosphere of the night. Inside the home, Steve could hear the faint sound of dishes being washed. It was his wife, Celeste, cleaning up after dinner. To anyone looking in from the outside, it seemed like the perfect, peaceful retirement life. Steve had worked incredibly hard to earn this peace. He had spent decades building a massive fortune as a successful business owner and a television station executive, eventually amassing a net worth of over $10 million. But while Steve was incredibly wealthy, his life had not been without its deep tragedies. Only about 6 years earlier, Steve had lost his first wife, Elise, to cancer. They had been happily married for 45 years and had raised 3 wonderful children together. When Elise passed away, Steve was completely devastated. He felt utterly lost, wandering through his days in a fog of grief. He spent his evenings sitting alone at the Austin Country Club, staring into space, trying to figure out how to navigate the rest of his life without his partner, and that was when he met Celeste. Celeste was only 30 years old at the time, which meant she was almost 40 years younger than Steve. She was working as a waitress at the country club, and there was an immediate spark between them. She was vibrant, full of life, and she paid attention to Steve when he felt completely invisible. They began talking, and before long, they were spending all their time together. Just over a year after they met, they were married. Now, of course, Steve's friends and family immediately had their doubts. Given the massive age gap, many people in Steve's circle assumed Celeste was simply after his money. Steve was a multimillionaire, and Celeste was a young waitress struggling to make ends meet while raising her twin teenage daughters, Christina and Jennifer. But Steve did not care what other people thought. He was deeply in love, and more than that, he felt a strong sense of purpose in helping Celeste. He took incredible care of her and her daughters, providing them with a level of stability, luxury, and safety that they had never experienced before. He treated the twin girls like they were his own, and to Steve, the money was a small price to pay for the joy and companionship Celeste brought back into his life. But despite the comfortable life they now shared, Celeste struggled deeply with her mental health. She had battled severe depression for much of her life, and earlier that year, in 1999, things had reached a tragic breaking point. Celeste had tried to end her own life. Fortunately, the attempt was unsuccessful and she survived, but the incident was deeply traumatic for the entire family. As a result of the attempt, Celeste spent several weeks in a psychiatric hospital receiving treatment. While it was a dark and painful time, Steve tried to look on the bright side. While at the hospital, Celeste had been prescribed new medication that seemed to be helping her immensely. She had also made some close friends during her stay, people who understood what she was going through. To Steve, it felt like Celeste was finally on the right path, and he was incredibly hopeful that their lives were about to turn around. This positive turn in Celeste's health was incredibly timely because Steve had recently been dealing with serious health problems of his own. Twice in the previous few months, Steve had suddenly passed out and had to be rushed to the hospital. The doctors had run a battery of tests, but they could not quite figure out why he was fainting. They knew he had high blood pressure, sleep apnea, and some minor heart and kidney issues, but none of these seemed to fully explain the sudden loss of consciousness. Steve suspected the fainting spells were simply related to stress. He figured he just needed to unwind and take a break from everything. To help them both recover, Steve had planned a massive 3-week vacation around Europe. They were scheduled to leave in just 2 days. After everything they had been through that year, Steve felt like some quality time, just the two of them, was exactly what they needed. But when Steve got up from his seat on the patio, picked up his empty cocktail glass, and walked into their master bedroom, he noticed something that made him feel a bit uneasy. He had packed his own suitcases days ago, but when he looked into Celeste's closet, her bags were still completely empty. She had not packed a single item. Steve could not help but feel like Celeste was getting cold feet about the trip. It seemed like she was deliberately putting it off, and he did not understand why. He walked down the hallway and into the kitchen, where he found Celeste finishing up the dishes. He gently brought it up, telling her that since they were leaving so soon, she really ought to start packing her things. Celeste just smiled and told him not to worry. She said she had just been incredibly busy all week, but she would get to it very soon. Steve nodded, but he was not entirely convinced. Still, he decided not to press the issue. He looked over at the clock on the kitchen wall. It was barely 9 o'clock in the evening, but Steve felt completely exhausted. He told Celeste he was going to head to bed. Celeste told him that she wanted to stay up a bit longer. She explained that one of her twin daughters, Jennifer, was having a sleepover with some friends at the family's lake house that night. Celeste said she might drive over there later in the evening just to check on them and make sure they were doing okay. She told Steve that if she did go, she would sleep in a different bedroom when she got back so she would not wake him up. Steve thanked her for being so thoughtful, gave her a kiss goodnight, and walked back down the hallway to the master bedroom. He got changed, climbed into bed, and put on his oxygen mask, which he used every night to manage his sleep apnea. Within minutes, he drifted off to sleep. Hours later, at around 3 o'clock in the morning, Steve was suddenly jolted awake by an excruciating, blinding pain in his stomach. The bedroom was pitch black, but Steve could feel that something was terribly wrong. He reached down instinctively and touched his abdomen, and his hand immediately became soaked in something warm, thick, and wet. In a complete panic, Steve ripped the oxygen mask off his face and tried to sit up to see what was happening. But the moment he moved his torso, the pain intensified to an unbearable degree, and he collapsed back onto his pillows. Trembling, he reached over to the nightstand and clicked on the lamp. When the light flooded the room, Steve gasped in pure terror. There was blood everywhere. It was smeared across his hands, his stomach, and soaked deep into the bedsheets. It looked like his entire abdomen had been ripped open, and he was in so much shock that he could barely process what he was seeing. He began screaming out for Celeste at the top of his lungs, begging for help. But the house remained completely silent. No one answered his cries, and Celeste did not come running into the room. Realizing he was entirely on his own and bleeding to death, Steve forced himself to reach for the telephone on his nightstand. With shaking, bloody fingers, he dialed 911. A few miles away, a dispatcher for the Travis County Sheriff's Department was nearing the end of a long, quiet night shift when Steve's call came in. The voice on the other end of the line was weak, raspy, and filled with sheer panic. The caller said his guts had been blown out of his stomach. The dispatcher, completely taken aback, tried to get the man to explain exactly what had happened, but the caller was too disoriented to give a clear answer. He just kept repeating that he had woken up, his guts were hanging out, and he was currently holding his own intestines inside his body with his bare hand. He desperately pleaded for an ambulance to be sent to his address immediately. The dispatcher quickly mapped the location to a mansion in a wealthy neighborhood of Austin and dispatched emergency services to the scene. Within minutes, a squad car from the Travis County Sheriff's Department pulled up to the massive gates of the Beard Mansion, its red and blue lights flashing against the dark trees. Deputy Alan Howard climbed out of his vehicle and quickly made his way up the long driveway. When he reached the front of the house, he found a fire captain and 2 other deputies already there, pounding heavily on the front door. But no one was answering. All Deputy Howard knew was that a resident inside had called with a severe, highly confusing medical emergency. The dispatcher had not been able to get any details about how the injury had occurred, only that it was life-threatening. Howard knew that every single second mattered. They could not afford to stand outside and wait. Since the front door was locked and no one was responding to their knocks, Deputy Howard decided to search for another way inside. He left the front porch and began walking along the side of the massive house, scanning the windows and doors for any sign of entry. The other deputies followed closely behind him. As they made their way around the property, Howard noticed a wooden staircase leading up to a raised patio. The patio was directly attached to a bedroom on the second floor. Howard climbed the stairs, and when he reached the top, he looked through the glass sliding door. The bedroom light was on. Through the glass, Howard could see an elderly man lying in the bed. The man was still conscious, clutching a telephone receiver in one hand, while his other hand was completely covered in dark red blood. Howard grabbed the handle of the sliding door and pulled, but it was locked tight. Knowing there was no time to lose, Howard drew his heavy-duty metal flashlight, smashed the glass door, reached inside to unlock the latch, and slid the door open. He and the other first responders rushed into the room. The moment Howard got to the side of the bed, he was horrified by what he saw. The man on the bed had a massive, gaping hole in his midsection, and his intestines were literally spilling out onto the sheets. It was clear that the man had been trying to physically hold his own organs inside his body. Howard knelt down and asked him what had happened, but the old man could only shake his head weakly. He said he had no idea. He told Howard that he had simply gone to sleep, and then he had woken up in agonizing pain with his guts spilling out. While the fire captain quickly opened his medical kit and began trying to bandage the horrific wound to stem the bleeding, Deputy Howard began scanning the bedroom for any clues. He shone his flashlight across the carpet, and just a few feet from the bed, he spotted something small, round, and yellow. He bent down to get a closer look. It was a spent 20-gauge shotgun shell. The moment Howard saw the shotgun shell, the entire nature of the call changed. This was not a bizarre medical accident. This man had been shot at point-blank range while he slept, and more importantly, Howard realized that the shooter could very well still be hiding somewhere inside the massive mansion. Howard immediately drew his service weapon, signaled to the other deputies, and stepped cautiously out into the dark hallway. Howard moved through the house with extreme caution, checking behind doors, in closets, and scanning every corner of the dark rooms. The mansion was absolutely enormous, with multiple wings and high ceilings. As he searched, Howard noticed that there were numerous potential entry points. There were several doors and windows throughout the home, and many of them were completely unsecured. When he entered the main living room, he walked over to a set of sliding glass doors that led out to the back of the property. He reached out and pushed them, and they slid open easily. They had been left completely unlocked. Just a few feet away from the doors, Howard noticed an overturned table lamp lying on the floor. It looked as though someone had knocked it over in a hurry, perhaps while scrambling to get inside or escape the house in the dark. Howard continued his sweep, moving from the living room into the formal dining room and then into the kitchen. Everything was quiet and still. He then made his way down a long hallway into a completely separate wing of the mansion. He came to a closed door, gently turned the knob, and pushed it open. Inside, he saw a woman lying in a bed, seemingly fast asleep. Howard lowered his weapon, stepped into the room, and flipped on the light switch. The sudden light startled the woman, and she sat up quickly, rubbing her eyes in confusion. Before she could ask what was going on, Howard identified himself as a deputy with the sheriff's department. He explained that they had responded to a 911 call from the other side of the house and that a man had been very severely injured. The moment Howard said this, the woman's face twisted in horror. She began sobbing hysterically, crying out that it must be her husband. She begged Howard not to let him die, her voice cracking with pure panic. Just a few seconds later, a teenage girl came running into the bedroom. She looked terrified, and she immediately threw her arms around the sobbing woman, holding her tightly. Howard watched them closely. As a law enforcement officer, he had to keep his guard up, but from everything he could see, this woman and her daughter appeared to be completely devastated and in shock. Howard asked the woman to identify herself. Through her tears, she managed to explain that her name was Celeste Beard, and that the man in the other room was her husband, Steve Beard. She added that the teenage girl holding her was her daughter, Christina. Howard felt confident that Celeste and her daughter were not an immediate threat, so he told them to stay exactly where they were for their own safety while he finished clearing the rest of the house. He could still hear Celeste sobbing loudly behind him as he stepped back out into the hallway. Howard spent the next 15 minutes thoroughly searching every remaining room, bathroom, and closet in the mansion. The house was empty. Whoever had pulled the trigger and shot Steve Beard was long gone. A few hours later, at around 5:30 in the morning on October 2nd, Sergeant Paul Knight arrived at the hospital in Austin. Knight was a seasoned criminal investigator with the Travis County Sheriff's Department, and he had been assigned to lead the investigation into the shooting. He walked through the quiet hospital corridors and stopped at the front desk to speak with the attending nurse. The nurse informed him that Steve Beard was currently in the operating room in critical condition. She explained that the shotgun blast had caused massive internal damage, and it was touch and go. Questioning him was completely out of the question for the time being. Knight thanked her, handed her his card, and asked her to contact him immediately if Steve's condition stabilized. As Knight turned to leave, he scanned the waiting room. In the corner, he saw one of his deputies speaking with a woman in her 30s and a teenage girl. The deputy spotted Knight and waved him over. Knight walked across the room and introduced himself to the woman who was Celeste Beard and her daughter, Christina. Knight knew that what he had to do next might seem insensitive given the circumstances, but in a shooting investigation, time was of the essence. He sat down opposite them, opened his briefcase, and pulled out a gunpowder residue test kit. He gently explained that before they spoke about anything else, he needed to swab both of their hands. Celeste looked startled and asked if she was considered a suspect. Knight gave her a reassuring but professional response, explaining that in the early stages of any shooting investigation, everyone in the home had to be treated as a potential suspect. He explained that conducting the test now was the absolute fastest way to rule them both out and allow investigators to focus their attention elsewhere. Celeste, still visibly shaken and weeping, agreed and held out her hands. Knight carefully ran the chemical test strips across her palms and fingers. Christina then held out her hands, and Knight repeated the process. They sat in silence for a minute, waiting for the chemical reaction to occur. When the strips remained clear, Knight confirmed that the tests were negative. Neither Celeste nor Christina had fired a weapon recently. With that crucial detail out of the way, Knight's demeanor became much more gentle. He asked Celeste to walk him through her movements from the previous night. Celeste wiped her eyes and explained that Steve had gone to bed early, around 9 or 9:30, because he was exhausted. Shortly after he went to sleep, Celeste decided to drive over to their lake house, which was about 30 minutes away, to check on her other daughter, Jennifer, who was having a sleepover with some friends. Celeste said she spent some time at the lake house and then drove back to the mansion, arriving home around midnight. She said the house was completely quiet when she walked inside, and she did not notice anything unusual. Because she did not want to disturb Steve, who was a light sleeper and used an oxygen mask, she went straight to a guest bedroom in the opposite wing of the house and fell asleep. The next thing she knew, Deputy Howard was flipping on her bedroom light and telling her that Steve had been shot. Knight listened closely, taking detailed notes. He asked Celeste if she knew of anyone who might have a grudge against Steve, or if there was any reason someone would want to hurt him. Celeste shook her head, saying that Steve was an incredibly generous man who did not have any enemies. But then, she paused and mentioned a detail that caught Knight's attention. She said that just the previous afternoon, Steve had gone to the bank and cashed a very large check. He had wanted to leave a substantial amount of cash for her twin daughters to use as spending money while he and Celeste were away on their trip to Europe. Celeste suggested that perhaps someone at the bank had seen Steve cashing the check, realized he had a large amount of cash on him, and followed him home to rob the mansion. It was a plausible theory, but Knight kept his thoughts to himself. He thanked Celeste and told her she could step outside to get some air. Celeste stood up and walked out of the hospital to smoke a cigarette. Once she was gone, Knight turned his attention to 17-year-old Christina. He asked her what she had experienced during the night. Christina explained that she had been fast asleep in her bedroom and had not heard a single thing. The first thing she remembered was waking up to the flashing emergency lights outside her window. As Knight questioned her, he noticed that Christina seemed incredibly careful with her words. She was not behaving like someone who was lying or trying to cover up a crime, but rather like a young girl who was deeply traumatized and struggling to make sense of a chaotic, horrifying event. Before Knight could ask any more questions, the heavy double doors of the waiting room swung open, and another teenage girl ran inside. She looked identical to Christina. She rushed over, and the two sisters threw their arms around each other, crying uncontrollably. Christina introduced the newcomer as her twin sister Jennifer. Just moments later, two teenage boys walked into the waiting room and joined the family. Christina explained that the boys were her and Jennifer's boyfriends. After the teenagers sat down and consoled each other, Knight turned to Jennifer and asked her where she had been the previous night. Jennifer explained that she had been at the family's lake house for the sleepover. She said she had been there all night with her boyfriend and another friend, and that the moment they heard about the shooting, they had rushed straight to the hospital. Knight nodded and decided to ask the group of teenagers the same question he had asked Celeste. Did any of them know anyone who might want to hurt Steve? The moment the words left Knight's mouth, he saw Christina and Jennifer exchange a very brief, knowing look. It was a subtle gesture, but to an experienced investigator like Knight, it was incredibly revealing. Christina turned back to Knight and said there was actually one person she could think of. She named a woman named Tracy Tarleton. Christina explained that Tracy was a close friend of her mother's. She said the two women had met earlier that year while they were both patients at the psychiatric hospital. But Christina said there was something incredibly off about Tracy. She described Tracy as being highly unstable and possessive. Christina said that she and her sister had gotten the distinct impression that Tracy was actually in love with their mother, Celeste, and was obsessed with her. As Christina spoke, the other teenagers in the group began nodding in agreement. They all chime in, saying that Tracy's behavior was incredibly strange and that she seemed completely fixated on Celeste. Just then, a fifth teenager walked into the waiting room. Jennifer introduced her as Amy Cart, the friend who had been staying with her at the lake house the night before. Knight decided to test something. Without giving Amy any context about what the other teenagers had just said, he asked her if she knew of anyone who might want to harm Steve Beard. Without a single second of hesitation, Amy looked at Knight and said, "Tracy Tarleton." To Knight, this was incredibly significant. The fact that all of these teenagers, including one who had just walked through the door with absolutely no prior knowledge of the conversation, immediately pointed the finger at the exact same person was a massive lead. He knew he needed to look into Tracy Tarleton immediately. Later that afternoon at around 3 o'clock, Sergeant Knight drove to a quiet working-class neighborhood in Austin and pulled up in front of a modest ranch-style house. This was the home of Tracy Tarleton. Before leaving the station, Knight had run a background check on Tracy. He had discovered two highly interesting facts. First, Tracy did indeed have a history of mental health struggles, which aligned with what the teenagers had said. But second, and most importantly, Tracy held a registered weapon permit for a 20-gauge shotgun. That was the exact same caliber as the spent shell found on the floor of Steve's bedroom. Knight walked up to the front door and knocked. Within seconds, the door swung open. Tracy Tarleton stood there, looking at Knight as if she had been expecting him. Knight introduced himself and calmly informed her that Steve Beard had been shot and was currently in critical condition at the hospital. Knight watched Tracy's face closely for any reaction. He expected to see shock, confusion, or horror. Instead, Tracy's expression was one of pure fear. She did not look surprised by the news at all. Instead, she looked like someone who had just been caught. Tracy immediately asked Knight if she needed a lawyer. Knight replied that the decision was entirely up to her, but asked if he could come inside to speak with her. Tracy hesitated, then stepped aside and led him into her living room. Once they were seated, Knight asked Tracy about her relationship with Celeste Beard. Tracy admitted that they had met at the psychiatric facility earlier that year. She candidly explained to the detective that initially, her feelings for Celeste had been romantic. She said she had fallen deeply in love with Celeste, but then she quickly added that those feelings were entirely in the past. She claimed that they had since established boundaries and were now simply close friends. Knight made a note of this, but then asked her where she had been the previous night. Tracy claimed she had been at home alone the entire time. She said she had ordered a pizza, drank a few beers, and gone to bed early. Knight then asked the crucial question: did she own any firearms? Tracy did not lie. She said she owned a 20-gauge shotgun, but claimed she only used it for clay shooting. Knight asked if he could see the weapon. Tracy hesitated for a long moment, her eyes darting around the room. But eventually, she walked over to a nearby closet, opened the door, and pulled out a zippered black gun case. She unzipped it, revealing a 20-gauge shotgun. Knight asked if he could take the gun down to the ballistics lab for testing. Tracy, knowing that refusing would make her look incredibly guilty, reluctantly agreed and handed the weapon over. Later that same afternoon, Knight went back to the Beard mansion. He wanted to conduct another thorough walkthrough of the crime scene to see if there was anything the initial responding officers had missed. To help him, he had asked Celeste's twin daughters, Christina and Jennifer, to walk through the house with him. Since they lived there, they would be able to instantly spot if anything was out of place or missing. As Knight walked through Steve's bedroom, he noticed that several dresser drawers and closet doors had been left open. It looked like someone had been searching for valuables, as if a burglary had taken place. But as Knight looked closer, something felt wrong. In a typical home invasion, burglars are in a massive rush. They rip drawers completely out, dump the contents onto the floor, and leave a trail of total chaos. But here, the drawers were pulled out neatly. The contents inside were relatively undisturbed. It looked incredibly deliberate, almost as if someone had carefully staged the scene to make it look like a robbery after the fact. Knight asked the girls to look through the open drawers and see if they could identify anything that was missing. After looking around for a few minutes, Christina pointed out that Steve's expensive watch and his favorite sapphire ring were gone. On the surface, this seemed to support the robbery theory. But to Knight, it felt like the exact opposite. The mansion was filled with incredibly valuable antiques, expensive electronics, and high-end artwork. If a burglar had broken in, why would they bypass all of these easily accessible, highly valuable items just to take a watch and a ring? It made no sense. He became increasingly convinced that the robbery was a cover story. Knight began to wonder if someone inside the family was involved. Steve was worth over $10 million. In the event of his death, that fortune would be divided. Knight did not know the details of Steve's will yet, but he knew that Celeste stood to inherit a massive portion of his estate. It was impossible not to consider the possibility that Celeste, a woman 40 years younger than her husband, had orchestrated the attack to get her hands on his fortune. As Knight walked down the hallway, pondering these theories, he looked up and noticed a wooden trapdoor in the ceiling that led to the attic. He realized that this area had not been checked during the initial search. Knight reached up, pulled the cord, and lowered the ladder. He climbed up into the dusty, dark attic space. As he shone his flashlight around, he noticed a cardboard box sitting on the floor just a few feet away. What caught his eye was the state of the box. While everything else in the attic was covered in a thick layer of gray dust and old cobwebs, this box was completely clean. It had clearly been placed there very recently. Knight walked over, opened the lid, and gasped. Inside the box was a 20-gauge shotgun. Knight immediately packaged up the weapon, carried it down the ladder, and stepped back into the hallway. The moment he reached the bottom, he saw Jennifer standing there, staring at the box in his hands. She looked incredibly nervous. Before Knight could even ask her about it, Jennifer began speaking rapidly, trying to explain. She claimed that she had purchased the shotgun as an anniversary gift for her boyfriend. She said she had hidden it in the attic so he wouldn't find it before the anniversary. She insisted that the gun had never been fired and was brand new. Knight listened to her explanation, but he was highly skeptical. It seemed incredibly suspicious that Jennifer had not mentioned the presence of a second 20-gauge shotgun in the house, especially when she knew her stepfather had just been shot with that exact caliber weapon. Even though Jennifer had a solid alibi for the night of the shooting, having been at the lake house sleepover, Knight could not shake the feeling that the twin sisters might be involved. He wondered if perhaps the twins had plotted with their mother to eliminate Steve for the inheritance. After all, the teenagers had been incredibly quick to point the finger at Tracy Tarleton. It felt almost too perfect, as if they had prepared a scapegoat beforehand to divert suspicion away from themselves. Hoping to get some clear answers, Knight drove back to the hospital that evening. When he arrived, the nurse at the front desk gave him some good news. She told him that Steve was finally out of surgery, his vitals were stable, and he was conscious enough to speak. Knight felt a surge of hope. If he could talk to Steve, the victim himself might be able to tell him exactly who had walked into his bedroom and pulled the trigger. But when Knight reached the door of Steve's hospital room, his hope evaporated. Taped directly to the glass window of the door was a handwritten sign. It stated that no law enforcement personnel were allowed to enter the room or speak with the patient unless the family's defense attorney was present. As Knight stood there, staring at the sign in disbelief, he heard rapid footsteps behind him. He turned to see Celeste rushing down the hallway. She looked furious. She marched right up to Knight, physically blocking the door to the room. In a cold, sharp voice, Celeste informed Knight that she was officially revoking her permission for any further searches of their home. She told him that if the police wanted to speak to her husband, they would have to schedule a formal meeting through their attorney. Knight was completely stunned. In his entire career as a detective, he had never seen the wife of an attempted murder victim hire a defense attorney to prevent the police from speaking to the victim. It was incredibly suspicious. If Celeste was completely innocent and wanted her husband's shooter caught, why on earth would she prevent him from speaking to the investigators? Knight had to wonder if Steve even knew about the sign. Was Steve the one who had asked for an attorney, or was Celeste making that decision for him while he lay helpless in his hospital bed? Knight knew that legally he could not push past her without a warrant. To avoid jeopardizing the case, he had no choice but to turn around and walk away. But as he left the hospital, his suspicion of Celeste grew tenfold. A few days later, on October 7th, Knight sat at his desk, staring at his case folder. He had spent the last several days running background checks and interviewing everyone connected to the family. He had thoroughly investigated Steve's 3 adult children from his first marriage. All of them had solid alibis and lived hours away from Austin. When Knight had spoken to one of Steve's sons, the son had told him bluntly that the police needed to look closely at Celeste. He explained that the entire family had always believed Celeste was a gold digger who had married Steve purely for his wealth. But Knight was facing a major logical hurdle. He knew that Celeste could not have been the one who physically pulled the trigger. He had tested her hands for gunpowder residue less than 3 hours after the shooting, and the results had been completely negative. The same was true for her daughter, Christina. And Jennifer had been at a lake house 30 minutes away with multiple witnesses. So if the family was involved, how had they pulled it off? Knight kept coming back to Tracy Tarleton. Tracy had a registered 20-gauge shotgun, she had a weak alibi, and she was obsessed with Celeste. But Tracy had no criminal record and no obvious motive to kill an elderly man she barely knew, unless she had been put up to it. As Knight was pondering this, another detective walked into his office. He had a wide grin on his face and was holding a manila folder. He tossed the folder onto Knight's desk and told him that the ballistics report had just come back from the lab. Knight eagerly snatched up the folder, flipped it open, and read the results. The forensic technicians had completed their analysis of the spent yellow shotgun shell found on Steve's bedroom floor. They had compared the firing pin impressions and the microscopic scratches on the brass casing to test fires from the shotgun Knight had seized from Tracy Tarleton's house. It was an absolute, undeniable match. The shell that had been used to shoot Steve Beard had been fired from Tracy Tarleton's gun. Armed with this definitive forensic evidence, Knight obtained an arrest warrant for Tracy Tarleton. On October 8th, less than a week after the shooting, a team of deputies surrounded Tracy's house and took her into custody without incident. When Tracy was brought into the interrogation room, she looked completely broken. Facing a charge of attempted capital murder, she decided to cooperate. She confessed to the investigators that she was indeed the one who had walked into the Beard mansion and shot Steve. She claimed that she had done it entirely on her own. Tracy told the detectives that she was deeply, desperately in love with Celeste. She believed that Steve was a cruel, abusive husband who was making Celeste's life a living hell. Tracy claimed she had shot Steve because she wanted to rescue Celeste from her unhappy marriage and have Celeste all to herself. At the time, Celeste vehemently denied any knowledge of Tracy's plan. She acted like a shocked, grieving wife who had been completely betrayed by a delusional, obsessed friend. Since Tracy insisted that she had acted alone and there was no direct physical evidence linking Celeste to the shooting, the police could not arrest her. Celeste remained free, while Tracy was held in jail awaiting trial. For a few months, it seemed like the case was resolved. Steve Beard remained in the hospital fighting for his life. He underwent multiple surgeries, and for a while it looked like he might actually recover. But the internal damage from the shotgun blast was simply too severe. On January 22nd of the year 2000, Steve's body finally gave out and he passed away. With Steve's death, the charges against Tracy Tarleton were upgraded to capital murder. But behind the scenes, the dynamic between Tracy and Celeste was about to undergo a massive, dramatic shift. While Tracy sat in her jail cell, facing the death penalty or life in prison, she clung to the belief that Celeste loved her. She believed that once she took the fall, Celeste would support her, and eventually they would be reunited. But then, just 5 months after Steve's death, Tracy received a piece of news that shattered her world. Celeste, who was now a wealthy widow after inheriting a massive portion of Steve's $10 million estate, had just gotten remarried. She had married a man she had met at a bar only a few months after her husband's death. When Tracy learned of this, the illusion was instantly shattered. She realized with devastating clarity that Celeste had never loved her. She had been completely used. Celeste had manipulated Tracy's fragile mental state and her romantic obsession, using her as a human weapon to eliminate her husband so she could inherit his millions and live a life of luxury. Filled with rage and a desire for justice, Tracy contacted her attorney and asked to speak with Sergeant Knight. She was ready to tell the real, complete story of what had happened leading up to the night of October 1st, 1999, based on Tracy's detailed confession, as well as subsequent witness interviews and phone records. The authorities were finally able to reconstruct the shocking truth of the conspiracy. It turned out that the romantic relationship between Celeste and Tracy was not a one-sided obsession. The two women had been engaged in a passionate, highly secret affair for months. But Celeste was incredibly clever. She knew that if she simply divorced Steve, she would get a relatively small settlement due to their prenuptial agreement. But if Steve died, she would inherit almost everything. To facilitate the affair and lay the groundwork for the murder, Celeste had begun secretly drugging her husband. She knew that Steve enjoyed having a cocktail or two on the patio in the evenings. Celeste began secretly slipping Everclear, a highly potent, tasteless alcohol that is 95% pure spirit, into Steve's drinks. Steve had no idea he was consuming such a massive amount of alcohol. He thought he was just having a standard cocktail. This explained the mysterious fainting spells that had hospitalized Steve in the months leading up to the shooting. Celeste was deliberately getting him so incredibly intoxicated that he would black out and pass out. Once Steve was unconscious in their bedroom, Celeste would slip out of the mansion and drive over to Tracy's house to spend the night, returning before Steve woke up the next morning. Over the course of several months, Celeste systematically brainwashed Tracy. She constantly lied to Tracy, telling her that Steve was physically and emotionally abusive. She claimed that Steve was keeping her prisoner in the mansion and that she was terrified for her life. Celeste told Tracy that the only way they could ever be together and the only way Celeste would ever be safe was if Steve was dead. Initially, Tracy resisted the idea, but Celeste was a master manipulator. She used Tracy's deep love and protective instincts against her, slowly wearing down her resistance until Tracy became convinced that killing Steve was an act of mercy and rescue. On the night of October 1st, the plan was put into motion. Celeste got Steve drunk as usual, ensuring he would sleep deeply. She then told him she was going to check on her daughter at the lake house and would sleep in a guest room upon her return. This was a calculated move to establish her alibi. Celeste then contacted Tracy and told her that tonight was the night. She informed Tracy that she would leave the sliding glass doors to the living room completely unlocked. At around 2:30 in the morning, Tracy drove her car toward the Beard mansion. To avoid drawing attention, she turned off her headlights as she approached the property. She parked at the very edge of the sprawling estate, far from the house, so the sound of her engine would not wake anyone. With her 20-gauge shotgun slung over her shoulder, Tracy walked through the dark, wooded property toward the mansion. As she approached the steps of the patio, she felt a sudden rush of panic and nausea. She did not want to do this, but she remembered her promise to Celeste, and she believed she was saving the woman she loved. She walked around to the living room sliding doors, which Celeste had left unlocked just as promised. Tracy slid the door open, stepped inside, and made her way through the dark house to the master bedroom. She found Steve fast asleep, his oxygen mask covering his face. Tracy walked to the foot of the bed. She stood there for a moment in the dark, her hands shaking violently. She raised the shotgun, aimed it directly at Steve's abdomen, and pulled the trigger. The blast was deafening in the quiet room. Steve instantly groaned in pain as blood began pouring from his wound. In a panic, Tracy racked the shotgun's slide, ejecting the spent yellow shell onto the carpet. She prepared to fire again, but she saw Steve start to fumble toward his nightstand. Fearing he might have a gun of his own, Tracy panicked. She knelt down briefly to search for the spent shell in the dark, but she could not find it. Terrified of being caught, she abandoned the search, ran out of the bedroom, down the hallway, and out through the living room doors. In her haste, she knocked over the table lamp. She sprinted back to her car, drove home, washed the gunpowder from her hands, washed her clothes, and thoroughly cleaned her shotgun before putting it back in its case. Celeste, meanwhile, had waited at the lake house to solidify her alibi. She then returned to the mansion, slipped into the guest bedroom, and pretended to be fast asleep when the police arrived. She'd even staged the master bedroom drawers to make it look like a robbery, hiding Steve's watch and ring to throw off the investigators. On March 28, 2002, based on Tracy's detailed testimony and the wealth of corroborating evidence uncovered by Sergeant Knight, Celeste Beard was arrested and charged with capital murder. Her trial was a massive media sensation in Texas. The prosecution painted a picture of a cold, calculating, and ruthless woman who had used her charm and manipulation to destroy a wealthy man who had done nothing but love and support her. Tracy Tarleton took the stand as the state's star witness, detailing every aspect of the affair and the conspiracy. In the end, the jury did not buy Celeste's defense. She was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to life in prison. Because of her full cooperation and her willingness to testify against Celeste, Tracy Tarleton's charges were reduced. She was convicted of murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. After serving her time, she was released on parole in 2011. The tragic death of Steve Beard left a deep, painful wound in the lives of his biological children, who had to watch their father suffer an agonizing months-long death, all because of the greed of a woman he had tried to rescue from poverty. It remains a haunting reminder of how easily love and generosity can be exploited by a master manipulator. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments, and remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.